One of the most notorious serial killers in American history called Salt Lake City home for 2 years. Though he was executed in 1989, his impact on serial killer criminology and true crime culture continues strongly to this day. This is the dark and depraved tale of Ted Bundy, and this is Below the Salt. Okay. Ted Bundy.
Ted Bundy.
It's the big one.
Yes, it is. I wanted to say too that I know people are always like, "Oh, I've heard so much about Ted Bundy. Like, it's so oversaturated. Like, it's boring, and I always skip that episode."
Really?
Well,
You've heard that?
Oh my God, all the
Really?
time.
Oh, I've always I
don't skip them.
Yeah, no.
Because I think it's interesting.
He's very interesting.
But people always say that in like the podcast groups that I'm in that are true crime related. They're always like, "Oh, Ted Bundy's boring." Well, I disagree. So we're doing an episode. In fact, we're doing 2 episodes on him.
Yeah, this is a 2-parter.
They're not going to be super long, and no, not all of his stuff was in Utah, but he was here, and he's famous.
And there's quite a bit to cover because of course there's so much press on him, and he's he was very prolific, and he was active for years and years, and he's got it's dramatic. Like, it is not just someone went out and killed someone every once in a while. Like, there's just all sorts
and they're not even this might be horrible to say, but they're not run-of-the-mill murders either.
No,
they're brutal.
They're interesting.
Yeah.
And his pathology is
very interesting.
Is very complex.
Yeah.
So.
And the other thing I wanted to say, just in conjunction with what I had said about people saying that he's boring. Well, we posted a tease about Ted Bundy just the other day, and on our Instagram, and we got more likes than we have on any other post ever.
Yeah.
So people clearly are interested.
People are very interested, and hopefully it's not people who like Ted Bundy, because that's gross. That's not okay. So, obviously Ted Bundy, since he operated here for 2 entire years, that's longer than he operated, as far as we know, in the Pacific Northwest, and definitely longer than he did in Florida. But everyone in Utah has a Ted Bundy story, I feel like. My family has one. My aunt claims that she was approached by him at Fashion Place Mall, which
I was going to say, even just
there, so.
You and I, we live close to Fashion Place Mall.
Oh, very close.
We drive through that parking lot all the time.
I can be like, hey, that's the spot where Carol Durant escaped from him. It's very interesting. So it's very much part of Utah's true crime culture. So we would be remiss to not cover Ted Bundy.
Absolutely.
Come on.
This is our season 2 finale.
This is our season. Well, so technically next episode is our finale, but this is our 2-part finale. And we're wrapping up season 2, and we're working on figuring out what we're doing for season 2.
Yeah, our schedule might change just a little bit due to everything going on with COVID-19.
Yeah, the world is crazy.
Yeah, I hope everybody's doing okay.
Yeah, seriously, we hope
we're doing okay. We're actually really fortunate in our lives.
Yeah, both of our employment is safe. We're no one in either of our families is ill, and we're just bunkering down.
Yep.
Have been for 4
almost
weeks
a month now.
Yeah, almost a month. So it's crazy times. So speaking of crazy times, eventually the crazy times we're going to mostly be talking about is the 70s, which is kind of for lack of a better term, the golden age of serial killers. But of course, Ted wasn't born. Born. Wow, I suddenly picked up an.
I like that we
accent.
both took a sip of water at the same time.
We did, which is really great, because everyone loves that dead silence.
Definitely.
Or the gulping sound. All right. So Ted was not born in the 70s. Of course, he was born in the 40s. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th, 1946.
No.
He's a Sagittarius.
My best friend is a Sagittarius.
Oh, yeah?
She was born November 22nd.
Oh. Well, that's the cusp date.
I know.
So she's a Scorpio cusp,
Sagittarius.
Sagittarius.
She's definitely a Sagittarius, though.
Interesting. Okay. So, he was born to 22-year-old Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, which just sounds like something that wouldn't exist today, in Burlington, Vermont. His father's identity has never been confirmed. His birth certificate assigns paternity to a salesman and Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall. But Louise claimed that she was seduced by a quote-unquote old money war veteran named Jack Worthington. No relation to me, Jack.
No.
Which, honestly, an old money war veteran named Jack Worthington kind of sounds like made up.
Yeah, I feel like you could look him up, too. And has anybody ever?
Can you look up someone in the 40s? It's a little trickier than it is now. But
an old money war veteran, I feel like you could look up.
All the old money Worthingtons in the United States.
Yeah.
All right, anyway. But... So, to cast a shadow of doubt on both the names Lloyd Marshall and Jack Worthington, a few Cowell family members have expressed suspicions that Bundy may have been the product of a violent incest incident by his grandfather, the monstrous Samuel Cowell. But no evidence has ever been found to support this.
Honestly, as far as those three theories go, that is the one that I believe the most.
That one holds the most water. I mean,
definitely.
Like, there would be
and just
more
the fact
details.
That their own family was saying it is so icky. Like,
yeah, you don't just be like, oh, I bet it was her dad.
Yeah,
like,
even if Ted,
like, you don't just throw that out there.
Even if Ted's dad is someone else, like, there's clearly something going on there.
Something very wrong.
You know, it's super nasty.
Well, it's because Samuel is a monster. He's a total bigot. He hates like every race under the sun. I'll get into him in a minute.
Okay.
For the first 3 years of Ted's life, he lived in the Philadelphia home of his grandparents Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, who raised him as their own son to avoid the social stigma of being born out of wedlock.
Great.
Which is problematic. Like, it causes more problems than it solves.
Definitely.
Like, you know, if you can just...
I knew a kid when I was like 8 or 9 whose sister was actually his mom and his mom was actually his grandma, like the situation. But like, the whole neighborhood knew, but he didn't.
Yeah, it's like...
So it's not like you're doing such a great job.
Well, and it's just like every family has, you know, has drama. Has drama and problems.
Yeah. And like, you're so much older. Wouldn't it just be easier to be like, oh yeah, his dad died?
Or something. Well, if you're going to lie about it, that's an easier lie for my, you know, if I had to say something.
Yeah.
But like, honestly, you know, honesty and openness
I agree.
is much better policy than, what will the neighbors think? Because obviously the neighbors knew something else anyway. It's just like, but it was the 1940s.
Oh my God.
It was a bad time for women.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it was not good. That being said, it is it's nice to raise your grandkids. You know, like if your kids need to have you raise their kids for you, like it's a good thing for grandparents to help out, but not maybe to this extent.
No.
So everyone, including young Ted, were told that his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his older sister. In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmly of his grandparents and told Anne Rule, who we'll get into a little bit later. She's a fantastic true crime writer that Ted knew personally. That he identified with and respected the man who was his grandfather.
Who was a monster.
Might have also been his father.
Yeah.
However, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel Cowell was a tyrannical bully and a bigot who was very racist, beat his wife regularly, beat the family dog regularly, and would repeatedly swing neighborhood cats around by their tails.
Great.
So he's like, he has an uncontrollable violent temper.
Quite a temper.
Which, you know, obviously hurting animals is part of the McDonald triad of violence.
Yes.
So... yeah, that doesn't speak well for the nature side of Ted's
or nurture.
Or nurture.
And neither of them, like,
yeah. So he's being raised by someone and possibly genetically related. Well, he's definitely genetically related at least once to someone who has violent tendencies.
Yeah.
So. He once threw Ted's Aunt Julia down a flight of stairs for the horrible crime of oversleeping. Yikes. He sometimes spoke aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. So a little more evidence into the Ted was Ted's dad theory there. Ted described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and feared to leave her house toward the end of her life.
Ooh.
So he's coming by mental illness strong from both sides here. So there's a lot of nature being poured into his serial killer soup here, if you will.
And the nurture again.
Yeah, and he's being raised by them. So.
Yep.
Ted Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behavior even at a very young age. His Aunt Julia recalled awakening one day to a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen. Her 3-year-old nephew Ted was standing by the bed smiling.
Yeah, don't like that.
Kids do weird and creepy stuff sometimes, even if they're perfectly normal, but like looking back on it, not so great.
Yeah, they don't do stuff like that though, usually.
Not usually. They usually just talk about like the man with no skin coming to attack you or something.
No skin. Anyways.
So in 1950, so when Ted was 4, or I think he was actually 3, Louise left Philadelphia with her son to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. So this is the part where I'm trying to figure out how he didn't know that his mom was his...
I know, right? Like, why do you just move away with your sister?
Yeah, why would you move away with your sister who's 20 years older than you? Like, I don't... Like, why wouldn't he be like, oh, well, something's up here?
Maybe not at the time when he's only 3 or 4, but later on you just realize it and be like, oh yeah,
that doesn't make sense that I would do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, the next year Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, and an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny Bundy formally adopted Ted. So also, if you're getting formally adopted by someone, wouldn't that kind of lend to the fact that this person that my older sister's marrying is adopting me? Maybe she's my mom.
Maybe she's my mom.
But again, he's like 5 at this point, so
yeah.
Who's to say?
You know what would kind of suck? If you adopted a kid and you know, we're pretty cool with them.
No, I'll get
had
into
a couple
the
kids with their mom,
here.
and then later on your name is famous because your stepkid that you adopted was a serial killer.
Your name? Yeah,
and now the most prolific recognition of your name is serial killer.
Yeah, that would not be super cool.
Yeah, that would
I think
suck.
Johnny might have passed away during his trial phase. So it might not have been like so big of a deal, but not
still.
Good. But, yeah. Johnny was actually Johnny and Louise had 4 kids of their own after Ted. But Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in camping trips and other family activities, but Ted always remained very distant. He later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, which is like right out of the Angry White Boy playbook. Yeah, you're not my real dad. He also complained that Johnny wasn't very bright and didn't make very much money, which tells us that Ted valued intelligence and money very much and thought very little of his actual family.
Yeah,
you know, the man who raised him.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, well, it's just like, I don't know. It's like a lot of what Ted gets into in his early development and what he tells psychologists later is that he didn't get interpersonal relationships. He just didn't understand how it worked, and that went for his family too. He did not have a close relationship with his mom, or with his grandparents, or with his stepfather, and he just didn't really understand how that worked, and that frustrated him, and that kind of fueled part of his misogyny later on.
Yeah.
So, in Tacoma, Ted used to roam his neighborhood every night. It was a habit that would continue all the way through until he was incarcerated. As an adolescent, he began picking through trash barrels in search of discarded pornography and committing petty crimes like shoplifting and stealing cars. He told biographers that he preferred to be alone, and he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships.
Yep.
He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop a friendship. He said, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what underlay social interactions." That being said, classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School told Ann Rule later that Ted was well known and well liked to an extent. He was a medium-sized fish in a big pond. So he was good at acting like he was part of the group.
As serial killers commonly are.
Yes, they are. Well, that's how you survive.
Yep.
So, downhill skiing was actually one of Ted's really only significant hobby aside from prowling neighborhoods and committing petty crime.
Like his normal hobby.
Yeah, but it's funny, he fueled it by committing petty crimes. He could easily access the sport through stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. His kleptomania and his outward charm and inward lack of emotion and character points to a likely case of antisocial personality disorder rather than a true psychopath.
Interesting.
So, he did have emotions, unlike a psychopath.
Who doesn't have any.
Right, he just didn't get people. And it just kind of fueled it. So, he's charming on the outside, hollow on the inside. Nothing going on. But he did still feel things. It's interesting. So he graduated from high school in 1965 and went to the University of Washington to study Chinese at first.
I didn't know he studied Chinese.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
it is interesting. And I think, from what I know about Ted at this stage, he hadn't really figured out what he wanted to do with his life, and he decided to study Chinese just because he thought, on a lark, because he thought it would be interesting.
Yeah.
Not because he had any grand ambition of going to do this.
Well, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah,
I feel like a lot of people still do that.
Absolutely.
When they're not sure, what their major they want or anything, they just will kind of start something that piques their interest.
And that's okay. You're not a serial killer automatically because you don't know what you want to be.
I don't know what I want to be.
Yeah, exactly. So, in 1967, he became romantically involved with a well-to-do and connected University of Washington classmate who was identified in media as a girl named Stephanie Brooks.
Poor Stephanie.
Oh man. She gets a lot of flack, if you had just married Ted, then he wouldn't have become a serial killer.
It's her fault.
Oh yeah, it's all
she just would have been Brooks' the first murder victim.
Yeah, probably, or some kind of victim for sure. In early 1968, he dropped out of college and worked at a series of minimum wage jobs. He became loosely involved in politics, not very involved, but he just volunteered for a few things. He joined the campaigns of two major Republican politicians in the area. So in August of 1968, Stephanie Brooks ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California. Now Stephanie Brooks was part of a very wealthy family, so her family expected her to marry someone wealthy or ambitious, someone that had a lot going on for them, right? So she was pressured, I don't know if it was completely external pressure or internal pressure, but she and Ted were not going to work out.
No.
So she was frustrated by his immaturity and his lack of ambition and said, "See you later, Ted." And this was something that kind of broke Ted a little bit.
Yep.
He didn't handle it well. Mostly because he's one of these kind of people who likes everything to go a certain way. And when he had finally had a relationship with someone, and he'd struggled with relationships.
He was probably feeling normal enough, for the first time in his life.
Cover for being normal well enough, and he felt that losing Stephanie was I'm not gonna, he felt threatened by it because he's like, I don't feel like I'm going to be able to fit in if I'm not in a relationship. People are going to see what I really am. They're going to reject me, and I'll die.
Yep.
That's how people with antisocial personality disorder work. So that freaked him out, and it caused a lot of resentment. So at this time in early 1969, a few months later, biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who actually knew Ted personally. We'll get into how they knew each other.
She wasn't a biographer or true crime writer at this time.
At the time, no. She was a police officer, actually, for Seattle. She believed that Bundy, after this breakup, went and visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington, Vermont, to find out who his dad really was, because he was obviously suspicious. That confirmed that his true parentage was unknown, or at least a fake name. Or something. The woman confirmed, of course, that his mother was his sister was in fact his mother.
Yep.
Which he had to strongly suspect anyway, considering everything that had happened.
It still didn't make him feel better.
No, it definitely made him feel worse. He felt, again, betrayed by women in his life. So, oh man. So, from this point on, he developed a lifelong resentment of his mother for keeping the facts from him, which, on some level, is fair to feel hurt. On another level, it's not fair to justify it for a murder spree.
No.
So, later in life, psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis pinpointed this double crisis moment as probably the most pivotal time in his development as a serial killer. His hatred of women and his misogyny was compounded during these events, and he began to act out various revenge schemes to satisfy his hate.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first stage of his scheme was to buckle down and get serious in preparation for part 2 of his scheme. Bundy returned to Washington in 1969 and began dating Liz Klopfer, who was a divorcee and single mother from Ogden, Utah. Hey, first Utah mention. Their relationship was amiable at first. It was everything. Well, I mean, he's a charmer, so
yeah. The more I've heard about it, the less I feel like the
relationship
okay.
was not good.
Even at first.
Yeah.
But I understand why it would seem that way to Liz.
And it seemed that way to Molly, who was Liz's daughter.
Yeah, but she was like super young, and again, Ted was super charming, and kids, particularly,
were one of his things.
Yeah, and they succumb easily to charm.
Yes, kids are easily charmed. Stupid kids. He would lash out at Liz in strange ways. There's a report of him pushing her off of a boat once.
Yeah, that's not normal.
If she would change her behavior at all, he would kind of freak out at that, particularly her hairstyle, which we'll get into later. But he was apparently always very good to Molly, which is like, well, at least. But only, secondhand, he's very bad to Molly. Liz suspected many of his possessions were stolen, which they were, because petty crime was one of his favorite things to do, and that much of his time was unaccounted for. In mid-1970, so that's one part of his life he was starting to shore up. He wanted to go legit, I guess, is really how, and prove himself to himself. It's kind of strange. In mid-1970, he re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student. Like, last time, like, he just, like, fucked around and, like, not taking his classes, and, like, he just didn't do anything. He just was a loafer. But he's, like, really focusing now, which is kind of spooky that he can kind of just flip it on like that. He was well regarded by his psychology professors.
Okay.
As a charmer would be.
Yeah.
In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, who was a former Seattle police officer. Rule saw nothing disturbing in his personality at the time and described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. It's so weird. Yeah. Someone with you can act empathetic.
Most people have a hard time being empathetic anyways.
Yeah, but he truly isn't empathetic, but he can act like it so well that that psychology professors don't even notice. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
Yeah. After graduating from the University of Washington in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel Evans' re-election campaign. Funnily enough, Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, where he notably wrote some pamphlets on rape prevention.
Oh my God.
Which is...
he was giving them counterintuitive tips.
Maybe he knew exactly. He could have given them perfect
I wonder
tips.
If we could find out, if we could ever find a copy of a pamphlet.
I think they have them. I think you can find them online.
Really?
Yeah. We could look them up later, maybe, and we could talk about it in part 2.
Yes.
After Evans was reelected, he was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, who was the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis really liked Bundy and described him as a smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system, which is like, the Republicans love him, but, we can't. John Wayne Gacy was a Democrat, so that kind of evens things out a little bit.
Oh, my God.
What? Are you okay?
Let's just move on. I could go on and on about how stupid I think that is.
But can you imagine where a world where Ted's political career took off
No.
before anything, and he like became president or something? That's freaky.
Yeah.
No, thank you. I'll pass. We're already in a pretty crappy timeline. We don't need that brought into the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So, in 1973, despite mediocre test scores, Ted was accepted into law schools of the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several of his psych professors. Ted knows that it's all about networking. It
really is.
What you know, it's who you know. So, even though his scores weren't very great, he was on top of it.
Do you think he was just like a bad test taker, or did he really not actually know that much?
He actually is not that intellectually intelligent.
That's kind of what I have always thought about him.
It's not that he's a bad test taker. He puts on the veneer of acting very intelligent, but he is not.
Confidence
so
goes a long way to convince people.
Yes, and he actually talks about that a little bit here. Yeah. I'll get into it in a moment. But it's really interesting because I read a lot of interviews about Ted before this.
Interesting.
And he talks like he's trying to impress people. He's like
It's like his image is very important.
His vocabulary is very strong. He uses a lot of like 5-syllable words and stuff. But under the surface, there's nothing there. He can like spin. He can walk around.
He's like not super thoughtful.
Yeah, he's not very introspective. He's not very creative. But he can make himself look very smart. It isn't. That's my theory. I'll just say that. But so that's Ted's first stage. You know, get school taken care of, get the career on track, get his personal life all shored up. So second stage is coming down the pipe. It really came into focus during a trip to California on the Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, when Ted rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks. She was impressed by his transformation into a serious, dedicated professional being on the verge of a career in law and politics.
Understandably.
Keep in mind, Ted is still dating Liz.
Yeah.
At this time, he is not like he didn't dump Liz to go out here.
No. He's just like an asshole on a normal level, even.
Yes, he's a run-of-the-mill asshole as well. He's not just a murderous asshole. Neither of them were aware that the other one existed. In the fall of 1973, Bundy studied at the University of Puget Sound Law School, kept dating Stephanie Brooks, who flew to Seattle several times to visit him. They even discussed marriage, and I think he actually did propose to her.
Ew.
At one point, he introduced her to his boss, Ross Davis, as his fiancée. Then, in January 1974, he ghosted her. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned for an entire month. When she finally made contact with him, she demanded to know why he had ended their relationship without an explanation. And in a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up the phone. And she never heard from him again.
Nope.
So the whole thing, months. They were together for 6 months. Whole thing was a giant revenge scheme, so Ted could prove to himself that he would be good. He's good enough for Stephanie.
And he's said that himself. That's not speculation.
No. He said, and I quote, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." The whole thing was a fuck you to her. Like,
yeah,
Brooks,
he's a monster. Like,
figured that he had planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance as vengeance for her breaking up with him in 1968.
Jesus.
So he is like that's beyond two-timing, dating two people separately. This is extreme.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Street level asshole.
It's horrible.
Right? Like, this is, yeah. So, that's phase 2 of his evil plan. After shattering the heart of Stephanie Brooks, Bundy dropped out of school again because he didn't actually care about going to school. He just did it to fuck with Stephanie Brooks. And as soon as all this went down, young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest at the rate of about 1 per month. This is the third stage of his revenge, planned or not planned, and it had finally begun. So, wow.
Yeah.
So that's a hell of an origin story for a serial killer.
Yes, it is.
And it just keeps on going. So something that kind of struck me when I read a book of interviews with Ted, and
what was it called again? Is it like The Mind of a Killer?
Yeah, In the Mind of a Killer.
Ted Bundy.
By the two investigators who interviewed him after he'd been convicted, and they do some great stuff to get him, because almost all the way until his execution, he did not admit that he did these things.
No, but we'll talk about that later too.
Evidence. But they managed to weasel it out of him in a really clever way. But something that struck me, that he talked about himself, is that it's not like serial killers just flip a switch and suddenly they're a serial killer. A lot builds up to that. Years, decades. He talked about how, his nighttime cruises that he would go around, he would peep into windows, of course, because he's a creep. He would look for discarded porn.
Yeah. He's a perv.
Yeah, and he would steal a lot. Yeah, he's a creep. His pathology made it so he couldn't just stop and enjoy that level of perversion. He couldn't. That wasn't enough for him. So the soup has been boiling here for a minute. You've got his violent childhood, his genetic makeup of someone who could very well be violent. You've got a vendetta against women. You've got just a pure lack of empathy for human beings. And so that's all going. He's still going out on these nightly whatevers. And so assaults start happening. He talks about the first time they were all crimes of convenience. He would never attack someone who he knew, which, he studied a lot of detective magazines, and he knew a lot about police procedure. He knew that, well, I'll get into it, but it just kept building and building, and finally he would assault someone, and then he would usually get scared off, and then he'd be like, oh man, I'm a monster, what have I done? And then slowly he'd start remembering that he liked it so much, and he'd build back up, and it only took about a month or so between them. He was no longer occupied by his revenge-fueled fake relationship. He dropped out of school. He could now focus on his escalating violence. Assaults and disappearances began to occur once per month. Psychologist Dorothy Lewis noted, the absolute misogyny of his crimes stunned me. His manifest rage against women. He had no compassion at all. He was totally engrossed in the details. His murders were his actual life accomplishments.
Gross.
And he had a very specific victim file.
Yes, he did. It's
knows
famous.
It. Yeah, everyone knows it. Usually young, middle class, college-aged white women with dark hair parted down the middle. Long dark hair. And it was never anyone he'd ever met. He wasn't going to kill Liz or Stephanie, most likely, because he would be the first suspect. And he wouldn't be able to keep killing people if he was in jail.
Nope.
He usually lured his victims by faking an injury with an arm cast or with crutches, and asked for their help. Of course, they borrowed that idea for Silence of the Lambs with Buffalo Bill.
Yeah, helping others is for dead people.
Yeah, and it's like, how much of a monster do you have to be like, oh, you know how I can really get people?
He's preying on women's compassion.
Yeah. And the fact that women are more, well, especially at this time when women had these crazy expectations, that if you're not helping someone, you're being a bad woman.
You're being a bitch.
Yeah, exactly. You are not fitting this mold of what women should be.
Yep.
And therefore you are wrong. So even though a lot of women did be like, no thanks, he would take advantage of the fact that women were more likely to help out because of the fucked up society they lived in. So
yep.
Once he had the women alone, he would usually incapacitate them with a bludgeon, which was most likely a crowbar or tire iron. He would handcuff them, take them to a very secluded, usually a mountainous, forested area, and sexually assault them. He would actually have them remove their clothes and then burn them, sexually assault them before strangling them either manually or with a garrote. And then he would kill them. During his confessions, Ted said that he visited Taylor Mountain, which is one of his dump sites, and Issaquah, which was the dump site for later victims during his Pacific Northwest spree, and other secondary crime scenes, often several times, to lie with his victims and perform sexual acts with their decomposing bodies until putrefaction forced him to stop.
Oh my god.
Which is probably the most horrific detail of the whole thing, as far as like the gross goriness of it.
He's a necrophile.
He is a necrophile.
Something that you and I have talked about before that I don't understand.
Necrophilia.
Well, no, I don't. But I don't understand how there isn't like more disease that you can get from having sex with a dead body.
A corpse.
Can you,
other than like a general like bacterial infection?
Oh yeah, but like what if Liz had gotten something because you've been having sex with these dead people? That's so disgusting.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like until they could no longer function.
Yeah, that means like even as they started to rot and were gross and like bloated and gassy and rigor mortis was set in, he was still having sex with them until like their bodies were literally falling apart.
And also he would usually decapitate them before they got to that point either. So they also had no heads. They were basically, So.
Thanks, I hate it.
Yeah. And also, he did weird shit with them. He's very much a product killer.
Oh, yeah.
He cared more about having the body and, quote-unquote, possessing the body. Because he's a thief at heart. He stole their lives. And once he had them, he could do whatever he wanted with them. And he loved owning them. Sometimes he would apply makeup to the faces of the corpses or repeatedly wash their hair. I think that was specifically some of his Utah kills. He said, if you've got time, they can be anything you want them to be. He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one of the severed heads in his Seattle apartment for a period of time before disposing of it. Ted very quickly became an organized product killer, one with a knack for exploiting holes in the 1970s police procedure, like leaving behind very little physical evidence at the initial crime scene. He would never use firearms because of ballistics and because they created noise. He would kidnap and kill in different spots to minimize the
second location.
Yeah, never go to the second location, crime victims. If you go to a second location, you're not leaving the second location. And also, he would always commit crimes in different jurisdictions, different parts of town, where different police forces wouldn't be able to coordinate with each other against him. While that was his general MO, his first few attacks varied from that pattern a little bit because it's an exploratory stage in the killing process, which is very common. Yeah. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, so this is actually, I think, right around the exact day that he broke up with Stephanie Brooks. We're not exactly sure what day that was, but it was right about when he ghosted her. On January 4th, 1974, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who is a dancer and a student at UW. After bludgeoning the sleeping woman senseless with a metal rod from her bed frame, he would often use found objects. He sexually assaulted her with the rod, which caused extensive internal injuries. He beat her so badly that she remained unconscious for 10 days, but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities.
That's crazy.
He probably thought she was dead. If
for sure. He wouldn't have left her.
Coma, so he wouldn't, but she did survive. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergrad who broadcast morning weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans. I think she was probably wearing underwear to bed or something like that. He put jeans on her, a white blouse and boots, and carried her away. He probably did that in case he got caught. He could explain something. She was his first confirmed murder.
Poor girl.
We're just gonna... Now, I'm gonna just kind of go through them and just share a few details. keep in mind that all of these people are human beings.
Yeah.
With families and people who cared about them.
Yep.
And that each one of these had waves of secondary and tertiary victims that, like, you know, we can say their names and talk about the details of their deaths, but, like, it's really impossible to impress upon you the impact that this has on families and communities. Like, yeah. So, just before I go any further, I wanted to address that. And this is happening every month. I mean, like, can you imagine how terrifying that would be for college students in particular? On March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, which is actually quite far outside of Seattle. It's, I think, the state capital of Washington. Left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus, but never arrived. Ted later recalled that he left Donna Manson's corpse on Taylor Mountain in the nearby forest of the Pacific Northwest, but he actually incinerated her head in Klopfer's Liz's furnace.
Ugh, that's
he said
disgusting.
This of the incident. Of all the things I did to Liz, this is probably the one she'd be least likely to forgive me for. Poor Liz. That's the first one I think that he didn't attack her in her home. He attacked her in transit. I think he figured that the chances of physical evidence are pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
He could lose a hair or leave a fingerprint or something on accident in a home, but if he grabs her before she gets into her car, the physical evidence drops.
Yeah, okay. I don't think they could identify stuff as well either back then, but yeah.
They could if they already had an idea of who was behind it.
Yes.
If they could fingerprint or match hairs.
Yes.
They couldn't get DNA from the hairs, but they could match them. On April 17th, just another month later, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, which is 110 miles east of Seattle. It's way outside of Seattle. Yeah. Two Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters. One on the night of her disappearance, and the other one was 3 nights earlier. So he'd been staking out this campus for like 4 nights with a man who was wearing an arm sling, asking for help carrying a load of books to his tan Volkswagen Beetle.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved Beetles. he had his choice of which cars to steal. He was very good at stealing cars. And he would always steal bugs. I guess maybe he knew how they worked a little bit better.
Yeah, I guess so.
But also, like, like, if the police are after you, stop stealing the same kind of car, you dope. Anyway, there's a few other things where I'm like, really, Ted? Like, you're so on top of other things as far as not getting caught. But a few other things, like, brazen. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, which is way outside of Seattle. It's, of course, in Oregon, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but she never arrived. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22 years old, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, which is near SeaTac. She was last seen in the parking lot, talking to a brown-haired man with an arm in a sling. In the early hours of June 11th, UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house.
That's really scary to me, too.
That is just like that.
You're in a pretty public area. Mm-hmm. It's well lit. You feel alright, and still something horrible happens.
Yeah, and they knew down to a certain amount of feet where he'd gotten her.
Ugh.
Because she was witnessed here, and she only had a certain distance to go.
Yeah, that's horrible.
The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminologist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing.
Mm-hmm.
After her disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing that a man that night who was in an alley behind a dormitory. He was on crutches with a leg cast, and he was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man had asked her to help him carry her case to his car, which of course was a tan Volkswagen Beetle.
Mm-hmm. Tan or kind of yellowy?
It's
a tan at the time.
It's like tan.
Interesting.
Which was a big color in the 70s.
Yeah.
Earth tones. Ted later described in graphic detail his abduction of Georgianne Hawkins from the alley. He had lured her to his car, before rendering her unconscious with a crowbar. He then handcuffed her and drove her to Issaquah, where he had strangled her before spending the entire night with her body. Ew. He later revisited her corpse on 3 separate occasions. He also admitted, and it's pretty far away. It's not like he could just pop in there. Like, he made effort. Yes, exactly. He also admitted that he returned to the alley the morning after her abduction and murder. In the very midst of the crime scene investigation, while those cops are combing the alley, like 20 feet away, he located and gathered Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes where he had left them in an adjoining parking lot and just walked away. It's a feat so brazen that it still astonishes police even today. During this time, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services. So, like, he's involved with the cops who are part of the investigation. It's a state government agency that was involved for the search for the missing women. At DES, he met and dated Carol Ann Boone. Again, while he was still dating Liz. Yeah. Ugh. He's a busy asshole. Man. Like, who has time for all this?
Yeah, I have no idea. I only work a part-time job, and I don't have time to have multiple partners.
Yeah, I have it in the script later. I'm like, how do you... He probably just doesn't sleep.
Yeah, no.
Like, he just doesn't. Yeah. Like, but
and he doesn't, like, clearly none of the time is quality.
No, well, nothing's doing it for him.
Yeah.
Yeesh. Carol Ann Boone is a twice-divorced mother of 2 who would play an important role in the final phase of his life. And yes, he was still dating Liz at this time. Yeah, so when does he have time for all this? I have a full-time job, a family, a podcast, and normal hobbies. And, like, I feel like my life is really busy.
I know, right?
You know, like, I'm like, holy shit. Like, dude, like, could you, like, if Ted could just, like, sleep, maybe, get him some Ambien or something, maybe, I don't know. Reports of the 6 missing women and Sparks' brutal beating were big news in Washington and Oregon, of course. Like, people going missing once a month.
Yeah, this is pretty unique.
That's not normal. Fear, of course, spread throughout the Pacific Northwest. Hitchhiking in the area ground to a halt. Women began dyeing their hair blonde to avoid his famous victim profile because people knew
because even already.
Well, you could just see it in the newspaper. You know,
6 women,
all these
they
women
all have the same haircut.
Exactly the same. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the scarcity of physical evidence and jurisdiction issues plagued the investigation. The Pacific Northwest murders culminated on July 14th at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. It's a suburb about 20 miles east of Seattle. 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit, so not trying to... He's not exactly trying to, like, super fit in. No. Like, he's in a white tennis outfit.
Yeah, like, why are you wearing a tennis outfit to the lake?
He had his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British.
Oh my god. Can you imagine Ted Bundy, like, in front of a mirror practicing his accents? Like...
Well, we know Ted really liked looking at himself in mirrors.
I know. Ugh.
So he would have...
So yes, I can imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. There's just a quick aside here. When I was reading this interviews with Ted book, there's a part where he's just talking about how pretty he thinks his feet are. Ew. His own feet.
His own fucking
nasty
feet.
Ass murder feet.
Ew.
So
he like loved his own feet. Like
it's so weird. Like this guy obviously he had problems.
Yeah.
He had,
like, and didn't he end up
so
finding like a contraband mirror to keep in his cell?
Yes, later
so
on,
that he could look at himself too?
Yes.
Ew.
He had a sneak mirror in prison so he could look at his pretty face.
Ew.
Alright.
I'm curious, by the way, just after you listen to this episode, comment on our post whether you think Ted Bundy's attractive or not. I know that's pretty split.
It's
opinion.
Pretty split.
I'm not gonna say what I think until the next episode, but I'm curious what other people think.
Yeah. Hit us up before part 2 comes out. Okay. So, he introduced himself as Ted to these people.
Yeah.
Funny.
Smart.
Couldn't fake a name? Like, all right, fake a name right now. What's your name?
Andrea.
Andrea what?
Smith.
Okay. Ted Bundy. I know it's you. You failed that.
Yeah.
You did.
I wasn't expecting it.
But Ted was expecting it. So he should have been able to do it.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Okay.
Andrea. Smith. Hey, let's look up the most common last names. What's at the top here?
It's common.
Yeah, I know it's common, but like, that was ridiculous.
What's yours?
Jack.
What's your fake name?
Oh.
Jesus Christ.
My name's...
You're such a dick.
My name's Jesus. My name's Frank Watterson.
Watterson? That's not even a real name.
I knew Wattersons. I did in my neighborhood growing up. I knew some Wattersons. My name's Frank Watterson.
Alrighty. And I'm
I think we
Andrea
both...
Smith. You didn't. You said your real name.
Failed.
You were more like Ted Bundy than I was.
What's your name? Jack.
My name's Jack.
My name's Ted Bundy, and here's my address.
It's like the quick murder on interdimensional cable.
Yeah,
on Rick and Morty. Yeah, quick mysteries. He's like, oh yeah, here, I did it. Here's the knife. Here's my DNA.
Thank you very much. I sent you to your life in prison. Okay. So maybe faking your name is harder than it might sound.
If I could plan it for a second. But if I was
planning a murder spree,
yeah, okay.
Probably wouldn't choose
right now, my name is Andrea Clancy.
Oh, well, you just looked at the bookcase.
Yeah, but see, even that's better than my real name.
You just Kaiser Soze it, though. You're just like,
I didn't Kaiser Soze Andrea.
Frank Vader.
My name is Lego Ant Lamp.
Lego Ant Lamp. Is that Danish?
It's Dutch.
Oh, it's Dutch. Okay, Ant Lamp. That's good. All right. So he should have done better, and he does later. He does fake a name later. Mm-hmm. He's Officer Rosalind later. Mm-hmm. Okay. So Ted, aka Ted, would ask people for help in unloading their sailboat from his tan Volkswagen Beetle. 4 people flat out refused to help him. One went with him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and just left.
Snoped right out of there.
Yeah, someone's like, hey, I need your help with my sailboat, and you get there and there's no sailboat, and he's like, oh, the sailboat's at my house, I think is what he said.
Oh, brother.
And they're like, bye.
Yeah, I'd be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to your house.
My Uber's here, so I'm gonna go.
Yeah.
So, 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, 23 years old, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story, and watched her leave the beach with him. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, which is like,
good for
a
her.
Computer programmer in 1974? You go, girl. She left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy told investigators that Ott was still alive 5 hours later when he returned with Naslund, and he forced one to watch as he murdered the other. In case you're unaware, Ted Bundy is a sick motherfucker.
Yeah.
King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Liz, Ann Rule, a DES employee, and a UW psych professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and all of them reported Bundy as a possible suspect. Which is like, thank you. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of courage in being like, hey, this person that
especially
I know...
Especially for Liz, like,
who lives
in a relationship with him. Like...
Yeah.
Yep.
Can you imagine, like, if someone came out with a police profile of, here's your murderer, and it's my buddy... whoever from high school who I know really well and still hang out with regularly, like, I wouldn't want to be the asshole who turned him in when he was innocent, you know.
Shout out to you, Bill, by the way.
Bill? Yeah, Bill. We're on to you, Bill. So, let's see. Sorry, I lost my spot. Sadly, the King County detectives, who got 5 separate reports of Ted Bundy, receiving about 200 tips a day.
Wow.
And they thought it was unlikely. They did check him out, and they thought it was unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator.
Well, yeah, he just doesn't look like a murderer.
Yeah, apparently they were expecting him to have the word murder tattooed on his forehead, or maybe like horns and a tail or something. Like,
yeah.
We know this now. they probably were thinking that it was
Still,
like
I feel like
Ed Gein or something.
even if that was like what the general public thinks, okay. But once you're a cop and you see some of the shit that you see, why do you keep thinking that people are gonna look a certain way?
No, the cops back then were like the worst.
I know they were the worst, but I just don't understand it. I don't understand it. Like it is so beyond.
Yeah.
Stupid to me that it can even be that way. I just don't get it.
Clean cut people can't murder people. Like,
you have a beard. Like
it's that same thing that bothers me about things like this don't happen here. I'm like, do humans not live there?
It happens everywhere.
Ah, frustrates me so bad.
Is there more than one human?
Yes.
It happens.
Then murder happens. In the Bible, there's like 4 people and a murder happens.
Yeah.
I'm not that I'm citing that as like a humanistic approach. Okay. That being said, the fact that 5 people did report him did keep his name on the long list of suspects, so he was technically finally known to police.
Mm-hmm.
Then, Ted up and moved to Utah, and the Pacific Northwest lost their monster.
There he goes.
There you go.
Yeah. Oh, jeez. Now here we are in Utah.
Well, here we are.
Look at us.
Who'd have thought?
Not me.
Yeah, he got accepted to the University of Utah.
Yep, he got accepted for a second time.
Yep. Oh,
by the way, he had dropped out before and re-enrolled.
University of Utah is my alma mater.
Yeah, good
I technically went to the same college as Ted Bundy. Yeah. Not the same college because it's like a law college.
Yeah.
And then I was over in the College of Humanities.
Yeah.
So different side of the campus.
I haven't gone to college.
I don't go to college.
Yeah. So he left Liz behind in Seattle, although they were still dating technically. He would call her often, but he did date at least a dozen other women while he was down here.
So he's a scumbag.
Oh, for sure.
Just in case
you were wondering.
We've well established this.
Yeah.
Cheating.
Yep.
Lying puss bag of human garbage.
Yep. He was studying law again.
Yeah.
Well, he moved down there in August, and by September 2nd, he had raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho.
Okay.
Yeah, he dumped the remains in a nearby river and returned the next day to take pictures of the corpse.
Gross.
Yes. So this is when
he must have had a ton of pictures. I think that he talks about how like he had a ton of pictures stashed away somewhere.
Yeah, that's grody.
So he could relive it.
Yeah, I hate it. Well, this is when his new accelerated string of murders began.
Oh boy.
So instead of killing every month, he was killing like every 2 weeks.
Ooh.
On October 2nd, he seized 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday City.
I know Holiday.
Yeah.
I used to work in Holiday.
Yeah.
Grandparents used to live there.
My grandparents still live there.
Oh yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah. It's a really nice actually part
of
town.
It's kind of like the ritzy old people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it is nice. But so she was abducted, and her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, about 200 miles south of here.
Okay.
But they haven't been found, which sucks.
Well, he might have just tossed out like a name too.
Yeah, who knows? But like, this sucks that they don't know where she is even, for sure.
Well, and also 16 is a lot younger because he'd been going after college-age girls, and like the youngest was like 18.
Yes, and the next couple are also kind of young. The next 3 are all 17.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so on October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, who was also the daughter of the police chief of Midvale, by the way, I hate it. She disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her body was found 9 days later, nude in the mountains. Post-mortem examination indicated that she may have been alive for 7 of those days.
So he kept is that the first time we've heard of him keeping someone alive
for that long?
Ooh. Yeah. Oh yeah, he kept what's her face alive
for hours. But it's horrible.
That's okay.
Yep. On October 31st, Halloween, Laura Ann Amy disappeared about 25 miles south of Holiday in the town of Lehigh.
Okay. Also know Lehigh. It's in Utah County.
Yes. This is after she had left a Halloween party at a cafe. It was just after midnight. Her also nude body was found on Thanksgiving, about 9 miles northeast in American Fork Canyon.
Jeez. So if someone's hiking on Thanksgiving and finds a body.
I know, some hikers. Isn't that horrible? Yeah, I can't imagine. Yep. So the 17-year-old girls, they had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings.
Yikes.
So yeah. On November 8th, in the late afternoon, Ted approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Durant.
Oh, I know Carol.
Yes.
I don't know her personally, but I know this story.
We know of her. She's badass. And this, of course, was at Fashion Place Mall in Murray.
We go to Fashion Place Mall
often.
There was actually like a gang shooting there.
Yeah, a couple months ago.
That was super spooky.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes. So
no one died, I don't think.
No. He approached her and claimed that he was an Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told Carol that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. Okay. She was concerned, of course, and a little bit cautious, but she did go with this undercover cop into his undercover car, which was a Volkswagen Beetle.
No red flags there for us who know what Ted drives.
And they took off down the road.
Okay.
Carol pretty much immediately realized that this was not the correct direction towards the police station, and she pointed this out to him, and that is when he immediately pulled over to the side of the road and reached over to handcuff her. Geez. Yes. During the struggle, however, he accidentally fastened both sides of the handcuff onto one hand.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is different than his smack and handcuff.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's because if there were still lots of people around.
Maybe.
Because they're at a mall, and it's not like you're exactly,
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no idea what his thought process is ever.
Well,
so.
Yes, no, it doesn't. Yeah. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So, anyways, because he accidentally fastened both sides of the handcuff onto one hand, Carol was able to still use her hands, and she opened the door and was able to escape. She ran from the car, and Ted did get out to chase her, which is terrifying.
Yeah, can you imagine?
No. Ooh. Yeah, but luckily, a couple of people, a couple of witnesses began to pay attention and gather.
Good for
yeah, because Carol, of course, was screaming out, she was not being quiet. Yeah, so Ted bailed. Carol immediately did go to the police office, so she ended up there anyways.
Yeah, she found her way to the Murray police station.
And she reported it, and then she also testified in court against him, and was really the first real legal hurdle of the trial later on.
Well, I'm glad Carol Ted fucked up here real bad.
Yes.
And good for that. I'm so glad that Carol and that Carol wasn't no, I don't want to press charges or and no. She's straight to the police.
Yeah, fuck him.
Yeah, let's ruin this dude because he's a monster and he deserves every second of it.
But unfortunately for 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent, Ted still wanted to kill that night. So she was a student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, which is about 20 miles north of Murray.
Yeah, that's not next to
Murray.
No,
it's not super close. So he drove up there, I guess kind of maybe was making sure nobody else was coming after him or something. I don't know.
Some distance.
Yeah. So
different jurisdictions.
Yeah. She was at her school leaving a theater production, and she was going to pick up her brother. Her drama teacher told police later that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car.
So he's pulling the whole identify car trick again.
Yes. Another student saw the same man, who was a police officer, pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him an additional time shortly before the end of the play. Outside the auditorium, real police officers,
not Officer Wilson,
found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Carol Durant.
So he dropped his key?
Yeah, 20 miles north.
And so they're investigating because Deborah Jean Kent disappeared.
That is a good connection because it's obviously the same person. Yeah. Because these are the keys that went to Carol Durant's handcuffs.
He
did the same police thing. Yep.
Interesting. Okay. Yep. So they're catching on to his new modus operandi.
Yep.
Okay.
So later that month, Liz called King County Police a second time after reading that young women had started disappearing in Salt Lake City, which she knew Ted was at.
Yeah.
And Detective Randy Hergesheimer? I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Hergesheimer.
It's a good name.
Yeah, strong German.
Yes. Of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. But by then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County hierarchy of suspicion, which is a good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. The Lake Sammamish witness was considered the most reliable by detectives, but they failed to identify him in a photo lineup. So.
Well, Ted had that face.
He did. He's a chameleon, man.
Yeah.
Like, that's part of why I'm interested to see if people think he's attractive or not. I guess I can just say it now because I really think sometimes, yeah, absolutely, I can totally see why girls, especially back then, would be a little smitten by him, right? Yeah. But there are other looks of his that are like, oh,
spooky,
ogre,
yeah,
horrible, and also dead eyes.
Well, and there's also like he also can look like neither. He can,
yeah,
like, he can
be
like
just super under the radar.
Yeah,
nothing.
That's kind of how I see him. I see him as just like. Yeah, I can see how some people think he's attractive.
Yeah, so it's super scary. But so I actually can get why he wouldn't have picked him out of the photo lineup.
You can see
and
why
especially
people
even with like the quality of photos back then, they're just not great.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. So in December, Liz called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions about Ted Bundy.
So she's obviously pretty sure.
Yeah, she's pretty sure. So his name was added to their list of suspects, but no forensic evidence was able to link him at that time. So
why are they so bad at finding forensic evidence?
So,
well, I guess they don't leave that much, but still.
So in January, and this is 1975 now, Ted returned to Seattle after his finals at the University of Utah and spent a week with Liz. She did not tell him that she had reported him to the police on 3 occasions.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that she didn't tell him because, like, what would have happened? But I also am like, if I had suspicions that you were something, I just wouldn't see you anymore.
Yeah, you would
especially
just be
when we were dating.
Yeah, no.
I would have been like, hey, I don't think it's gonna work out right now.
Bye.
Like,
although that could have gotten her killed too.
Yeah, but not if he was still down in Utah.
Ah, fair. Yeah, okay.
Just my opinion. I'm not blaming Liz for doing anything wrong. I'm just saying I would have done
Liz
it
is just
this way.
Is a victim.
Oh yeah,
absolutely. As much as anyone else is. You know, like she was doing the best out of a really, really bad situation.
Absolutely.
So, especially because she had a kid involved too.
Yes.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
Yes, and that just adds a whole other level of understanding it to me because you got to protect your kids, you know. So, 1975, and Ted shifted a lot of his criminal activity to Colorado. Yeah, perhaps realizing, stuff in Utah was starting to get a little sketchy for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, losing a victim will do that.
Yeah, exactly. And having somebody call your name, not that he knew that happened, but still. So on January 12th, registered nurse, 23 years old, Karen Eileen Campbell, disappeared while walking down another well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at Willwood Inn in Snowmass Village. This is about 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City.
Way out of town.
Yeah. Her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. Ugh. She had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear groove depressions on her skull. Ugh. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon like a knife or something.
I don't know if he used knives a ton.
No, yeah.
That's the first time I've heard of that he didn't just strangle the girl.
Yep.
Damn.
On March 15th, 100 miles. Yes.
Well,
about a month. Oh no, this is about 2 months.
Later, okay.
Yeah, he got a little busy moving around, or maybe there's some stuff we just don't know about in this time period.
Yeah, well, then there's a lot of question marks. Everything that we're talking today is just the confirmed stuff. Of course, there's every possibility that he started assaulting women earlier or murdering women earlier, or that there's a bunch in between that we just don't know.
Correct.
And who were just not as well reported.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so March 15th, about 100 miles northeast of Snowmass, Vail ski instructor Julie Cunningham, who was 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Oh. Ted later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her. And that's just like another thing, like if I saw somebody with on crutches and then they wanted help with their ski boots.
Well, he could have gotten hurt on the ski slopes.
True, but
and then needed help moving his stuff out of his hotel room.
Maybe, but that would be a little more suspicious to me. Again, not blaming her.
No.
Just saying.
It's important to put yourself in the position of the victims.
Yes.
And think about what would you do in that situation.
Yes, absolutely.
How could you protect yourself?
But that's why I think it's good to voice my opinion too, because maybe some people wouldn't have thought about that. Like, oh yeah, he's in crutches and he's carrying ski boots. Something doesn't click.
Yeah, exactly.
Just my 2 cents there. So he, of course, clubbed and handcuffed her, and then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site about 90 miles away. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake to visit her remains. So yeah, he is not like just popping in to see these bodies.
Yeah, he's driving hundreds of miles.
He's making special trips to go.
And like, what is he gonna see a week's later corpse for?
Oh, we know, but
That's so gross.
Yeah. The next person to disappear was Denise Lynn Oliverson, who was 25. She disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6th. She was riding her bicycle to her parents' house. And her bike and sandals were eventually found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge.
Okay.
And this one is horrible. Worst one. On May 6th, Ted Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High in Pocatello, Idaho. He drowned and sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in a river north of Pocatello.
That's the first that I've heard of him, like, in killing the person in the
like
city.
Back to his place, even,
That's
not just out somewhere in the mountains or anything.
I guess because she was 12 and could control her.
That was horrible. The next victim, Susan Curtis, was on June 28th. She vanished from the campus of BYU, Brigham Young University, in Provo, Utah. Her mother became her murder became Bundy's last confession, which took moments just before he was executed.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Right up to the last minute.
Yes. In August or September, he was fucking baptized into the LDS Church.
Yikes.
Or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons.
Depending on who you ask and what year it is.
Yeah.
That's the right name, of course.
He was not an active participant, and he ignored a lot of the restrictions that they had. Yeah. Of course, thou shalt not kill was a big one.
I think that most churches kind of go with that one.
Yes.
So.
And then when he later was convicted of kidnapping in 1976, he was excommunicated.
Okay.
So that's good. And then even when he was asked his religious preference, he answered Methodist, which was the religion of his childhood.
So he was just.
But he still was a fucking Mormon.
He got baptized just to blend in.
Oh, for sure.
And it's interesting because when he does get arrested, we'll talk about that in the next episode. His ward that he lived in, his LDS congregation, totally came out in support of him because he had convinced them that it was all a big fraud. Like he'd been set up for kidnapping.
And then I want to talk about that more in the next episode too, with the pornography.
Oh yeah, we'll get into that. That's at the very end of things. Yes. But yes, absolutely.
But just a note of what's to come.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Washington State, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it had begun.
Yeah, I can imagine being like, okay, this guy killed eight women, and then just like poof,
just stop.
Nothing.
Yep. And then, so out of the thousands of names of suspects, 26 turned up on 4 separate lists. So, of course, these 26 are the ones that they're going to focus on, right?
Yep.
And Ted Bundy was one of those 26 names. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and he was on that list as well.
Oh, okay.
He was literally at the top of the pile, as they say. Okay. So, word went to Utah of his arrest.
All right.
And what happens next will be for next week's episode, our, for sure, season 2 finale.
Yep. All right. He's going to get arrested.
Yes. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Whew.
He does not get away with this.
About time. Yikes. Okay. Well, that wraps up part 1 of Ted Bundy.
Yes, it does. Okay. And I'm Valerie.
And I'm Jack. And this is Below the Salt.